The old clock tower across the street chimed 5 times, its echo bouncing off the empty buildings. Inside the grand riverside concert hall, a man pushed open the heavy service door with his shoulder, careful not to spill the coffee in his worn thermos. His name was Daniel Chen, though nobody in this building knew that. To them, if they noticed him at all, he was just the janitor who arrived before the sun came up. Daniel set down his coffee on the supply cart and pulled out the industrial mop. The concert hall was massive, with burgundy seats that could hold 2,000 people. But at this hour it felt like a beautiful cave, silent except for the hum of the heating system. He liked it this way. No people meant no questions, no small talk, no need to explain why a 42-year-old man was mopping floors instead of doing something more with his life. He started with the lobby, pushing the mop in smooth strokes across the marble floor. The morning routine never changed. Lobby first, then the bathrooms, then the backstage area, and finally, the stage itself. 3 years of the same pattern, 5 days a week. His body moved on autopilot while his mind wandered to his daughter, Lily. She'd be waking up in about an hour. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door would get her ready for school, just like every morning. 8 years old and already too smart for her own good, Lily had started asking questions lately. Why did Daddy work so early? Why couldn't he come to her school plays that happened during the day? Why did they live in such a small apartment when her friend Katie had a big house? Daniel always found ways to dodge these questions, turning them into games or distracting her with her favorite pancakes. The truth was too complicated for a child to understand. How could he explain that sometimes life throws you curveballs so hard that you strike out completely? How could he tell her that the world she knew, safe and stable, existed only because he'd given up everything he'd once dreamed of? By 6 o'clock, Daniel had worked his way to the main auditorium. The doors opened with a soft whoosh and he stood there for a moment, taking it in. No matter how many times he saw it, the concert hall still took his breath away. The stage seemed to glow under the work lights, and right in its center sat the thing that made his heart skip every single morning, a 9-foot Steinway Model D concert grand piano. The piano was polished to perfection, its black surface reflecting the lights like a mirror. Daniel approached it slowly, pulling his cart behind him. He'd cleaned this piano hundreds of times, knew every curve, every inch of its surface. The cleaning crew wasn't supposed to touch the keys. That was for the specialized piano technician, who came once a week. But Daniel always cleaned around them carefully, making sure not a speck of dust landed on the precious instrument. As he worked, he could hear footsteps in the hallway. The early morning staff was starting to arrive. First would be the security guard doing his rounds, then the administrative assistants, and by 7:30, the directors and managers would start flooding in with their expensive coffee and urgent phone calls. Daniel kept his head down and continued working. He'd learned early on that being invisible was the best way to keep this job. Don't make waves, don't stand out, just clean and go home. The health insurance was too important to risk. Lily's asthma medication alone cost more than their rent some months. "Hey, you missed a spot," a voice called out. Daniel looked up to see Mr. Brennan, the facility supervisor, pointing at an imaginary mark on the floor. Brennan was the type of man who wore his small amount of power like a crown, especially around people he saw as beneath him. "Sorry, sir. I'll get it right away," Daniel replied, moving his mop to the area Brennan had pointed to. "Make sure you do. We have the Morrison Foundation Gala tonight. Big donors, important people. Everything needs to be perfect." Brennan adjusted his tie, though it was already straight. "Not that you'd understand these things, but this event raises money for children's medical research. We're talking millions of dollars." Daniel nodded, continuing to mop the already clean floor. He understood more than Brennan could imagine. He understood what it felt like to sit in a hospital waiting room, praying for good news. He understood medical bills that arrived like an avalanche, burying every dream and plan under an impossible weight of debt. After Brennan left, Daniel returned to cleaning the stage. He saved the piano for last, taking extra care with the polishing cloth. As he worked, his fingers accidentally brushed against one of the keys. The note rang out clear and pure in the empty hall, an F sharp that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Daniel froze. He hadn't meant to touch it. He glanced around quickly, but no one had seen. The sound faded, but something inside him had awakened, just for a second. It was like seeing an old friend's face in a crowd, unexpected and bittersweet. His hands remembered things his mind tried to forget. They remembered scales and arpeggios, Chopin nocturnes and Bach inventions. They remembered the weight of the keys, the way you had to press them just right to coax out the perfect sound. They remembered applause and standing ovations, competition stages and scholarship letters. But mostly they remembered the day he'd sold his own piano. It wasn't as grand as this Steinway, just an old upright Yamaha. But it had been his. The buyer had been kind, an older woman who promised it was going to her granddaughter. Daniel had nodded and smiled, counting the money that would cover another round of his wife's chemotherapy. That was 2 years ago, 6 months before she passed away. "Daddy plays pretty songs," Lily had said once back when she was 5, but she hadn't heard him play since then. These days, his music existed only in the humming he did while making breakfast, little melodies that escaped when he thought no one was listening. The morning wore on. More staff arrived, the building coming alive with the buzz of preparation for the evening's gala. Daniel finished the stage and moved on to the dressing rooms. Famous musicians had been in these rooms, he knew. Their photos lined the hallways, men and women in formal wear holding roses, shaking hands with dignitaries. Once upon a time, Daniel had thought his photo might hang on a wall like this someday. He'd won competitions, earned scholarships, had professors who believed he could make it. But that was before real life intervened. Before Lily was born premature and spent 2 months in the NICU. Before his wife got sick. Before he learned that talent and dreams don't pay for breathing machines and cancer treatments. Now, at 42, he was practical. He had a steady job with benefits. He had a healthy daughter who got good grades and loved to read. He had a small apartment that was always warm in winter. These things mattered more than any spotlight or applause ever could. As his shift neared its end, Daniel gathered his supplies and headed back to the service area. He passed by the box office where elderly volunteers were already arriving to prepare for the evening's event. One of them, a woman with silver hair and pearl earrings, looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Something flickered in her eyes. Not recognition exactly, but something close to it. Then she turned away, and Daniel continued walking. By 8:30, Daniel had changed out of his uniform and was heading home. The city was fully awake now, buses rumbling past, people hurrying to work. He stopped at the corner store to buy milk and cereal. Lily's favorite kind, with the marshmallow pieces that he pretended to disapprove of but secretly enjoyed too. Nobody passing him on the street would have guessed that this tired-looking man in faded jeans had once made a concert hall full of people rise to their feet. Nobody would have known that his hands, now rough from cleaning chemicals, had once danced across piano keys with the grace of someone born to make music. And that was fine with Daniel. Some stories were better left untold. Some sacrifices were worth making in silence. He had Lily and she had him, and that was enough. At least that's what he told himself every morning when he walked past that beautiful piano, fighting the urge to sit down and play just one more time. That afternoon, Daniel sat in his tiny apartment, staring at an old shoebox he'd pulled from the closet. Lily wouldn't be home from school for another hour, and he'd made the mistake of looking for her birth certificate for a school form. Instead, he'd found this box dusty and forgotten, pushed behind winter coats and broken umbrellas. Inside were pieces of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Concert programs with his name printed in elegant fonts. A review from the Chicago Tribune calling him a young pianist with the rare ability to make the piano weep and sing in the same breath. A photograph of him at 24, wearing a tuxedo, shaking hands with a famous conductor whose name still meant something in classical music circles. At the bottom of the box was a letter, creased from being read too many times. It was from the Manhattan School of Music, offering him a full scholarship for their master's program. He'd been 26 then, ready to take on the world. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Lily was born. Daniel remembered that day perfectly. He'd been practicing for an upcoming recital when the call came. His wife, Anna, was in labor. It was too early. She was only 7 months along. He'd rushed to the hospital, the scholarship letter still in his jacket pocket, forgotten in the panic of the moment. Lily had weighed 3 pounds when she was born. The doctors used words like respiratory distress and underdeveloped lungs. For 2 months, she lived in a plastic box, connected to machines that breathed for her, fed her, monitored every heartbeat. Daniel had sat by that incubator every single day, playing recordings of piano music on his phone because he'd read somewhere that music helped premature babies develop. The scholarship deadline passed while he was learning how to change a diaper around monitor wires. The recital happened without him while he was sleeping on a hospital chair. One by one, opportunities slipped away like notes in a song he could no longer play. But Lily had survived. She'd grown stronger, fiercer, more determined with each passing day. Just like her mother, Anna used to say. Anna, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse to support Daniel's music dreams. Anna, who'd believed in him when no one else did. Anna, who'd gotten sick when Lily was 5. Daniel closed the shoebox and put it back in the closet. Some doors were better left closed. He had work to do. The evening shift at the concert hall started at 4, and he needed to help set up for the gala. When he arrived at Riverside Concert Hall, the place was buzzing with activity. Caterers wheeled in carts of champagne glasses, florists arranged enormous centerpieces, and sound technicians tested microphones. Daniel changed into his uniform and got to work, setting up extra trash bins and making sure the bathrooms were stocked. Around 5 o'clock, he was polishing the brass railings in the main hall when he heard raised voices coming from the green room. Through the partially open door, he could see the evening's featured performer, a young pianist named Christopher something, arguing with Mrs. Winters, the event director. "This program is absolutely pedestrian," Christopher was saying, waving a sheet of paper. "Moonlight Sonata for Elise? These people could hear this music at any shopping mall. I'm an artist, not a jukebox." Mrs. Winters, a woman in her 60s who'd been running events at the hall for 20 years, kept her voice steady. The Morrison Foundation specifically requested familiar pieces. The donors want to enjoy the music, not be challenged by it. Then, they should hire a wedding pianist, Christopher snapped. "I trained at Juilliard. I've performed with the London Symphony. I don't do background music for rich people eating shrimp." Daniel continued polishing, pretending not to hear. He'd seen this type before. Young musicians who thought the world owed them something just for being talented. They didn't understand that music wasn't about them. It was about connecting with people, touching something deep inside them, whether they were wearing diamonds or dishwater. "Furthermore," Christopher continued, "this piano hasn't been properly maintained. The action is sluggish and the E-flat in the 3rd octave has a slight buzz. How am I supposed to create art under these conditions?" Daniel almost laughed. He'd cleaned that piano this morning and it was perfect. He'd heard world-class pianists play it without a single complaint. The problem wasn't the piano. "We can have the technician look at it," Mrs. Winters offered, though Daniel could hear the strain in her voice. "Don't bother, I'm done. Find someone else to play for your little charity dinner." Christopher stormed out, nearly knocking into Daniel as he passed. Mrs. Winters emerged a moment later, her face pale. She pulled out her phone, frantically scrolling through contacts. 3 hours, she muttered. "How am I supposed to find a classical pianist in 3 hours?" Daniel wanted to say something to offer help somehow, but what could a janitor do? He went back to his work, though his mind kept drifting to the crisis unfolding around him. The Morrison Foundation Gala was the biggest fundraising event of the year. His supervisor had said they were expecting to raise $3 million for children's medical research. Without music, the evening would feel incomplete. As he worked, memories kept surfacing, unbidden. He remembered his last real performance, the one he'd given at a small venue downtown just weeks before Anna's diagnosis. He'd played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece so complex and emotional that it had taken him years to master. The Gaume audience had been small, maybe 50 people, but they'd stood as one when he finished. tears on some of their faces. Anna had been in the front row, pregnant with Lily, glowing with pride. "You're going to be famous one day," she'd whispered afterward. "I just know it." But fame was a luxury for people who didn't have sick wives and premature babies. Fame didn't pay for chemotherapy or breathing treatments. Daniel had made his choice, and he'd make it again 1,000 times over. Lily was worth every sacrifice. By 6 o'clock, the guests were starting to arrive. Daniel stationed himself near the service corridor, ready to handle any cleaning emergencies. He watched men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns glide through the lobby, champagne glasses in hand, talking about stock markets and vacation homes. Among them, he noticed the silver-haired woman from this morning, the one with the pearl earrings who'd looked at him strangely. She was talking to a group of other elderly women, all dressed elegantly, all wearing the small gold pins that marked them as major donors to the Morrison Foundation. "I heard there's a problem with the entertainment," one of them was saying. The silver-haired woman, Mrs. Chen, Daniel heard someone call her, frowned. "That would be unfortunate. I specifically donated extra this year because they promised exceptional music. My grandson has been in the children's hospital 3 times this year. This cause means everything to me." Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He knew that feeling, the helplessness of watching a child suffer, of sitting in those sterile hospital rooms praying for miracles. He thought of all the families who would benefit from tonight's fundraising, all the children who might get better care, better treatments, better chances. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice Mrs. Winters rushing past, her phone pressed to her ear. "No, I understand. Yes, I've tried him too. I know it's short notice." Her voice was desperate now. The cocktail hour was ending. Guests were moving toward the main hall for dinner. In 30 minutes, there was supposed to be music. Daniel could see the empty piano bench from where he stood, the Steinway waiting silently under the lights. His hands tingled. It was a familiar feeling, one he'd tried to suppress for years. The music inside him was stirring like a creature waking from hibernation. He clenched his fists, forcing the feeling down. He was a janitor. He had a job to do, a daughter to support, a life that depended on him being invisible and reliable. But as he watched Mrs. Winters' face crumble as another rejection came through the phone, as he thought about Mrs. Chen's grandson and all the other children this gala was meant to help, something inside Daniel shifted. Maybe just this once being invisible wasn't the right choice. Maybe just this once, the music deserved to be heard. He didn't make the decision right then. He just stood there, torn between 2 worlds, while the clock ticked toward the moment when someone would have to explain to a room full of donors that there would be no music tonight. The piano waited, patient and silent, for someone to bring it to life. The dinner service had begun, and Daniel busied himself emptying trash bins in the back hallway. Through the service doors, he could hear the clink of silverware on china, the murmur of conversation, and Mrs. Winters' increasingly frantic phone calls. She'd stepped into the corridor, probably hoping the donors wouldn't see her panic. 20 minutes, she was saying to someone. "Just 20 minutes of classical music. I'll pay double your normal rate, triple. Please, this is for children's medical research." Daniel pushed his cart past her, keeping his eyes down. She didn't even notice him. To people like Mrs. Winters, he was part of the furniture, no more noticeable than the wall sconces or the emergency exit signs. That was exactly how he wanted it, or at least, how he'd trained himself to want it. He entered the main hall through the back entrance to check the waste bins. The room was magnificent, with hundreds of candles flickering on the tables and the chandelier casting golden light over everything. The empty piano stood on the stage like an accusation, its bench pushed back, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. At the table nearest the stage, Mrs. Chen sat with her friends. She was staring at the piano with a sad expression, absently turning a wineglass in her fingers. Daniel moved quietly along the wall, trying to remain unnoticed. But as he passed her table, she suddenly stood up. "Excuse me?" she said. Daniel stopped, his heart jumping. "Yes, ma'am, is there something you need?" She studied his face, her eyes sharp despite her age. "I'm sorry, this might sound strange, but you look incredibly familiar. Have we met before?" I don't think so, ma'am. I just work here. I'm part of the cleaning crew. But Mrs. Chen stepped closer, tilting her head. No, I never forget a face. Especially not. She paused, her eyes widening slightly. My goodness, the Riverside Competition 2005. You played Rachmaninoff, the Piano Concerto No. 2. Daniel's blood turned cold. He shook his head. I think you have me confused with someone else. Daniel Chen, she said softly, and hearing his full name spoken aloud in this place felt like being struck by lightning. You won first place. I was one of the judges. I remember because I argued with Harold Steinberg for an hour about whether you or that boy from Boston should win. You made me cry with that performance. Please, Daniel whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else had heard. That was a long time ago. I'm not that person anymore. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. But you are. I can see it in your eyes, the way you look at that piano. My dear boy, what happened to you? Before Daniel could answer, Mrs. Winters appeared, looking defeated. She walked to the microphone on stage, tapping it once to get everyone's attention. Good evening, everyone. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we won't be able to present the musical portion of tonight's program. However, we have a wonderful silent auction. A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Daniel saw people checking their phones, already losing interest. He knew how these events worked. The music was what made people feel generous, what opened their hearts and their wallets. Without it, the evening would raise maybe half of what they'd hoped. Mrs. Chen was still looking at him. You could play, she said quietly. No, I can't. I'm just the janitor. You're a pianist. I was a pianist. Now I'm a father with a job that gives me health insurance and steady pay. Please, Mrs. Chen, just let it go. But Mrs. Chen had already turned to Mrs. Winters, who was stepping down from the stage. Margaret, she called out. Margaret, come. Here for a moment. Mrs. Winters approached, her face strained. Yes, Mrs. Chen? Is everything all right with your table? This young man, Mrs. Chen said, gesturing to Daniel. He can play piano. Mrs. Winters barely glanced at him. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate you trying to help, but we need a professional classical pianist, not someone who plays a little keyboard as a hobby. He won the Riverside competition in 2005, Mrs. Chen insisted. I was a judge. He's extraordinary. Now, Mrs. Winters did look at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time in 3 years. You're the janitor. Yes, ma'am. And you can play classical piano? Daniel felt trapped. Other people at nearby tables were starting to listen. He could feel their eyes on him, his carefully constructed invisibility crumbling. I used to play. I haven't performed in years. Can you read music? Mrs. Winters asked desperately. Yes, but can you play Beethoven? Mozart? Anything recognizable? Daniel's hands were shaking now. Mrs. Winters, I'm not dressed for this. I'm in my uniform. I haven't practiced. I can't. Please, Mrs. Winters said, and for the first time Daniel heard real emotion in her voice. We're trying to raise money for children's medical research. The Morrison Foundation specifically funds experimental treatments for childhood cancers and rare diseases. Without the music tonight, people will leave early. They won't stay for the fundraising appeal. We might lose $1 million in donations. Daniel thought of Lily, of all those nights in the hospital when she was a baby. He thought of other parents sitting in those same chairs, watching their children fight for their lives, praying for some new treatment, some medical breakthrough that might save them. Even if I wanted to, he said slowly. I haven't touched a piano in 2 years. My hands aren't what they were. Mrs. Chen reached out and gently took one of his hands, turning it over to look at his palm. His fingers were rough from cleaning chemicals, with calluses in all the wrong places for a pianist. But she smiled. The music doesn't live in your hands, she said. It lives in your heart, and I can see it's still there, waiting. More people were watching now. Daniel felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. For 3 years, he'd been safe in his invisibility. No one expected anything from him except clean floors and empty trash cans. If he sat down at that piano, everything would change. "What about my job?" he asked Mrs. Winters. "Mr. Brennan won't like this." Mrs. Winters glanced around the room at all the donors, at the empty stage, at the evening dissolving before her eyes. "Let me worry about Brennan. Right now, I just need someone who can play for 20 minutes. Even just one piece. Something. Anything. To save this evening." Daniel looked at the piano. From here, he could see the keys gleaming under the stage lights. He knew exactly how they would feel under his fingers. Cool at first, then warming to his touch. He knew the resistance of each key, the way you had to coax the music out rather than force it. "Daddy, why don't you play anymore?" Lily had asked him once, finding an old photo of him at a piano. "Sometimes we have to give up things we love for people we love more," he'd told her. But standing here now with Mrs. Chen's encouraging smile and Mrs. Winters' desperate hope, with a room full of donors who'd come to support sick children, Daniel wondered if maybe, just this once, he could have both. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the servers had stopped moving, sensing that something important was happening. Daniel looked down at his janitor's uniform. Dark blue pants, a matching shirt with Daniel embroidered on the pocket. Not exactly concert attire. "If I do this," he said quietly, "I need you to understand that I'm not a performer anymore. I'm just a father who used to play piano. Whatever happens up there, it won't be perfect." "Perfect isn't what we need," Mrs. Winters said. "We just need music." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He could hear Anna's voice in his memory, clear as day. "Your music is a gift. Don't hide it forever." When he opened his eyes, everyone was still watching him. The piano was still waiting. And somewhere in the city, Lily was doing her homework, not knowing that her father was about to step out of the shadows for the first time in years. "One piece," he said finally. "I'll play one piece." The relief on Mrs. Winters's face was almost painful to see. Mrs. Chen squeezed his shoulder gently. Around them, word was spreading through the room in whispers. The janitor was going to play. The janitor could play piano. Who would have thought? Daniel walked toward the stage, each step feeling like a mile. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, hear the rustle of confusion and curiosity. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. As he climbed the stairs to the stage, he caught sight of Mr. Brennan standing by the bar, his mouth hanging open in shock. Daniel almost turned back then, but Mrs. Chen had returned to her seat and was watching him with such faith, such certainty, that he kept walking. The piano bench was exactly the right height. He'd adjusted it himself this morning while cleaning. He sat down, the familiar position bringing back a flood of muscle memory. The spotlight was warm on his face, too bright to see the audience clearly, which was a mercy. Daniel placed his hands on his thighs, taking a deep breath. In a few seconds, he would touch these keys and everything would change. But change, he was beginning to realize, wasn't always something to fear. Sometimes it was just life's way of reminding you who you really were. Daniel sat at the piano bench, his hands still resting on his thighs. The concert hall had gone completely silent. Even the servers had frozen in place, holding their trays, waiting to see what would happen. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, but more than that, he could feel the weight of the years he'd spent hiding this part of himself. His fingers trembled as he raised them to the keys. For a moment, they hovered there, uncertain. The keys looked exactly as they had this morning when he'd cleaned them, but now they seemed to hold infinite possibility and infinite risk. What if he'd forgotten how to play? What if his hands, roughened by 3 years of manual labor, could no longer create the music that once flowed so easily? He pressed down on middle C. The note rang out clear and true, filling the vast space with sound. Just one note, but it was like a key turning in a lock he'd kept closed for so long. His left hand found its position, and without really thinking about it, he began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor floated into the air. He'd chosen it without conscious thought. It was the piece that lived deepest in his muscle memory, the one he'd played at his last real performance before everything changed. His fingers were stiff at first, uncertain, finding their way back to patterns they'd once known by heart. The first few measures were shaky. He could hear the imperfections, feel the hesitation in his touch. A woman at a front table whispered something to her husband. Someone coughed. Daniel almost stopped, the familiar voice of doubt creeping in. You're just a janitor. You don't belong up here. But then something shifted. As the melody began to build, his hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The music wasn't just notes on a page or patterns to follow. It was a story, an emotion, a piece of his soul that he'd locked away but never truly lost. The ballade grew more complex, the right hand carrying a melody that seemed to soar and weep at the same time, while the left hand provided a foundation that rolled like thunder. Daniel's eyes closed without him meaning to. He wasn't in the concert hall anymore. He was in a small practice room at the conservatory, 20 years old and full of dreams. He was in the hospital room, playing a recording of this same piece for baby Lily in her incubator. He was at Anna's bedside humming the melody because she said it helped with the pain. His hands flew across the keys now, the rust falling away with each measure. The janitor's uniform didn't matter. The calluses didn't matter. All that mattered was the music pouring out of him like water breaking through a dam. Every emotion he'd suppressed, every dream he'd abandoned, every sacrifice he'd made, it all flowed through his fingers into the piano. The piece reached its first climax, a section that required incredible technical skill. Daniel's hands responded without hesitation, years of training overriding years of absence. The notes cascaded through the hall like a waterfall, each one crystal clear, each one exactly where it should be. He could feel the audience's energy shift, the skepticism melting into something else entirely. In the quiet section that followed, Daniel opened his eyes for a moment. The spotlight was still too bright to see clearly, but he could make out shapes, shadows. People were leaning forward in their chairs. A woman in the front row had her hand pressed to her chest. Mrs. Chen was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. The music built again, more intense this time. This was the section that separated good pianists from great ones, the part where Chopin demanded not just technical skill, but complete emotional commitment. Daniel gave it everything. His whole body moved with the music, swaying with the rhythm, his foot working the pedals with precision he didn't know he still possessed. He thought of Lily as he played, of all the times he'd wanted to share this with her but couldn't find the words to explain why he'd given it up. He thought of Anna, who'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. He thought of every morning he'd cleaned this piano, fighting the urge to play just one note, just one chord. The ballade entered its final section, a whirlwind of notes that required absolute concentration. Daniel's fingers flew faster than thought, muscle memory taking over completely. This was the part that had taken him months to master, hours of practice every day until his hands cramped and his back ached. But now it flowed effortlessly, as if the years between had been nothing but a pause, a rest in the greater composition of his life. The final measures approached, the music reaching a crescendo that seemed to shake the very air. Daniel put everything he had into those last notes, all his love for Lily, all his grief for Anna, all his dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. The last chord rang out, powerful and definitive, and he held it, letting it resonate through the hall until it faded into perfect silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence was so complete that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. He sat there, hands still on the keys, afraid to turn around, afraid to see disappointment or worse, pity, in the faces of the audience. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. Not polite, measured clapping, but thunderous, overwhelming applause that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Daniel turned slowly on the bench to see the entire room on its feet. Everyone, the donors in their expensive clothes, the servers, still holding their trays, Mrs. Winters with tears streaming down her face, even Mr. Brennan, who looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mrs. Chen was standing at her table, clapping so hard her jewelry rattled. The woman who'd been crying in the front row was openly sobbing now, mascara running down her cheeks as she applauded. A man shouted, "Bravo!" from the back of the room. Others took up the cry. Daniel stood slowly, his legs shaking. He didn't know, what to do with his hands, where to look. He gave an awkward bow, the kind he'd been taught at the conservatory but hadn't used in years. The applause grew even louder. He started to walk off the stage, to return to his cart and his mop and his invisible life, but Mrs. Winters caught his arm. "Please," she said, having to raise her voice over the continuing applause. "Play another." "I said one piece." "The donations," she said quickly. "People are already pulling out their checkbooks. I just saw someone write a number with more zeros than I've ever seen. Please, Mr. Chen. For the children." Daniel looked out at the audience, still on their feet, still clapping. He thought of those hospital bills, of parents who would do anything to save their children, just as he had. He thought of Lily, who would understand why he'd done this, who would be proud of him for using his gift to help others. "One more," he said. The audience erupted in cheers as he returned to the bench. This time, when he placed his hands on the keys, there was no hesitation. He played Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, the one everyone knew because of its Turkish march finale, but he played it like they'd never heard it before, with a joy and freedom that came from finally being himself again. As the familiar melody filled the hall, Daniel saw people swaying in their seats. An elderly man was conducting along with his fork. Children who'd been dragged to this formal event by their parents were suddenly paying attention, their eyes wide with wonder. This was what music could do. It could unite a room full of strangers, make them forget their differences, remind them of their shared humanity. When he finished the Mozart, they demanded another. He played Debussy's Clair de Lune, gentle and dreamy, a complete contrast to the intensity of the Chopin. During the soft passages, he could hear people whispering, but not the bored chatter of earlier. They were whispering about the music, about him, about how extraordinary this all was. "Who is he?" he heard someone ask. "The janitor," came the reply, said with wonder rather than disbelief. "The janitor who plays like an angel." After the Debussy, Daniel stood again, and this time he was firm about leaving the stage. His hands were starting to cramp. They weren't used to this anymore, and his emotions were overwhelming him. The applause followed him off the stage, continuing long after he disappeared into the wings. In the service corridor, away from the lights and the eyes, Daniel leaned against the wall and tried to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, his shirt soaked with sweat. He'd done it. After 3 years of silence, he'd played again, and it had been magnificent. Not perfect, but real and raw and honest in a way his younger self had never achieved. Mrs. Winters found him there a few minutes later. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't have words. You saved the gala. You saved everything. I need to get back to work," Daniel said automatically. "The bathrooms need checking and—" "No," Mrs. Winters said firmly. "You're done with work tonight. Go home. Be with your daughter. And Mr. Chen, we need to talk about your future here. Someone with your gift shouldn't be hiding in the shadows." As Daniel gathered his things and prepared to leave, he could hear the excitement in the main hall. The auctioneer had started the fundraising appeal, and the numbers being called out were astronomical. $3 million, $4 million, $5 million for children's medical research, all because the music had opened their hearts. Walking out into the cool night air, Daniel pulled out his phone to call Mrs. Rodriguez and let her know he was coming home early. But first he sent a text to Lily. "Hey, sweetheart. When you wake up tomorrow, I have something to tell you, something about music." Daniel barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his hands still tingling from the piano keys. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear the applause, see the standing ovation, feel the weight of what had happened. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that the janitor was who he really was, but tonight had proven that some parts of yourself never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to come back to life. At 6 in the morning, his phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. Confused, Daniel picked it up to find dozens of notifications. Someone had posted a video of his performance on social media. Janitor stuns crowd with incredible piano performance at charity gala. Was already at 50,000 views and climbing. The comments were overwhelming. This made me cry at my desk. Who is this man? Better than most concert pianists I've paid to see. The emotion in his playing is unreal. Someone get this man a record deal. Daniel set the phone aside, his heart racing. This wasn't part of the plan. He just wanted to help with the fundraiser, not become some kind of internet sensation. Lily wandered into his room, still in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. Dad? Why are you up so early? It's Saturday. Daniel patted the bed beside him. Come here, sweetheart. I need to tell you something. She climbed up, snuggling against his side. Are you okay? You look weird. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. He took a deep breath. Lily, remember when you asked me why we don't have a piano? You said they're too expensive. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Daniel pulled out his phone and found one of the old photos from the shoebox he digitized years ago. This is me, about 20 years ago. Lily looked at the photo of him in a tuxedo sitting at a grand piano. Her eyes went wide. That's you? You look so fancy. Wait, you can play piano? I can. Or I could. I used to be. Well, I was pretty good at it. How good? Good enough that people paid to hear me play. Good enough that I won competitions and got scholarships to study music. Lily sat up, staring at him like she'd never seen him before. Then why are you a janitor? Why didn't you tell me? Daniel pulled her close again. When you were born, you came too early. You were very sick, and the doctors weren't sure if you'd make it. I needed a job with good health insurance, steady pay, regular hours. Being a musician is wonderful, but it's not stable. I couldn't risk not being able to take care of you. But your mom got sick when you were 5. The medical bills were more than we could handle. I sold my piano to help pay for her treatment. After she died, I couldn't play anymore. It hurt too much. It reminded me of everything we'd lost. Lily was quiet for a moment, then she asked, Do you miss it? Every single day. Is that why you hum all the time? And why you tap your fingers on the table like you're playing something? Daniel smiled. His daughter noticed everything. Yeah, I guess so. Dad? Lily's voice was small. Did you give up your dreams for me? Oh, sweetheart, no. Daniel turned her to face him. You are my dream. You're worth 1,000 pianos, 1,000,000 concerts. I'd make the same choice every single time. But what if you could do both? Be my dad and play piano? Before Daniel could answer, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Winters. Mr. Chen, I hope I'm not calling too early. I couldn't wait. Last night's gala raised $8.3 million. That's more than triple our goal. And it's all because of you. Daniel sat up straighter. 8 million. The video of your performance has gone viral. Donors who left early are calling to make pledges. People who weren't even at the gala are donating. The Morrison Foundation wants to meet with you. They have a proposal. An hour later, Daniel and Lily sat in Mrs. Winters' office at the concert hall. Lily's eyes were huge as she took in the elegant space, the photos of famous musicians on the walls. The foundation wants to create a new position, Mrs. Winters explained. Pianist in residence. You'd perform at all our major fundraising events about once a month. The salary is, well, look for yourself. She slid a paper across the desk. The number made Daniel's breath catch. It was more than he made in a year as a janitor. But there's more, Mrs. Winters continued. The position comes with full health benefits for you and your daughter. And the Morrison Foundation wants to establish a scholarship fund in your name for young musicians whose families are facing medical hardships. You'd help select the recipients. Daniel's eyes burned with unshed tears. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Dad, Lily burst out. Please say yes. What about Mr. Brennan? My cleaning job. Mrs. Winters smiled. Mr. Brennan has been thoroughly educated about the value of every person in this building. But if you want to keep some hours for the stability, we can arrange that, though I don't think you'll need to. That afternoon, Daniel took Lily to a music store. She ran from piano to piano, pressing keys with delight. "Can you teach me?" she asked. "I want to play like you." "It takes a lot of practice," Daniel warned. "Every day, even when you don't feel like it." "I don't care, I want to learn." They rented a small upright piano, nothing fancy, but it was enough. When the delivery men set it up in their apartment, Daniel sat down and played a simple melody. Lily stood beside him, watching his fingers with complete focus. "What's that song?" she asked. "It's something I wrote for you when you were a baby. I used to hum it when you couldn't sleep." "I remember that. I thought it was just something you made up." "All music is just something someone made up," Daniel said, showing her how to position her hands. "Now, let's start with middle C." Over the next few weeks, Daniel's life transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The video of his performance reached millions of views. News stations wanted interviews. Professional orchestras reached out with offers. But Daniel was selective. He took the position with the Morrison Foundation and a few other performance opportunities, but his priority remained the same: Lily. The first scholarship recipient was announced a month later, a 12-year-old violin player whose father had cancer. At the ceremony, Daniel played while the boy performed, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Chen asked him afterward. She'd become a regular visitor, often stopping by just to hear him practice. "Like I'm finally whole again," Daniel admitted. "For so long I thought I had to choose between music and being a good father. I didn't realize I could be both." 6 months later, Daniel stood backstage at his first official concert as pianist in residence. This time, he wore a proper tuxedo. His hands were soft again, the calluses from cleaning chemicals replaced by the proper calluses of a pianist. But the most important change wasn't physical. "Dad, you're going to be amazing," Lily said, straightening his bow tie. She was backstage with him, wearing a new dress they'd bought especially for the occasion. "How do you know?" "Because you're you. And you don't hide anymore." She was right. The hiding was over. Daniel had learned that sometimes the biggest risk isn't in revealing who you are, it's in concealing it. His music had returned, but more importantly, he'd shown Lily that dreams don't always have to die. Sometimes they just hibernate, waiting for spring. He walked onto the stage to warm applause that grew thunderous when people recognized him. The janitor who became a pianist, or the pianist who'd been a janitor all along. The story had captivated everyone who heard it. But for Daniel, looking out at the audience and seeing Lily in the front row, beaming with pride, the story was simpler than that. It was about a father who'd lost himself trying to save his daughter, only to discover that she'd been the one to save him in the end. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. This time there was no hesitation, no doubt. The music flowed from him naturally, joyfully, the way it was always meant to, and in the front row, Lily watched her father shine, finally understanding that love wasn't about sacrifice. It was about finding a way to share your gifts with the world while holding the people you love close. The music filled the hall, but, more than that, it filled the empty spaces in their lives that had been waiting all along for this moment, this redemption, this second chance at everything.